Welcome everybody to today's discussion on Parshas Vayeira, particularly chapters 18 and 19, which is the story of the angels visiting Avraham and Sarah, immediately followed by the incident with Lot and overturning Sodom and Gomorrah. So I'm going to look at this through 3 or 4 different lenses, and we'll see what we come up with. So the first one is a typical one, that a typical Hasidic one that Rabbi Deitch has mentioned before. I think Rabbi Deitch has mentioned it before. What's interesting is that on the second part, when the angels show up to Lot's house, it says he baked matzahs for them. And Rashi just has a two-word comment on that. He said, Pesach haya, meaning it was Pesach. So obviously that's a little bit surprising, like what's going on here. The incidents of Yetzias Mitzrayim coming out of Egypt, the Exodus happened a couple hundred years later. Hold on one second. So what does that even mean, given that Pesach occurred a couple hundred years later? So a typical Hasidic explanation of this is a remembrance of the fact that Hashem created time. And just like the physical attributes of the world have different contours and different aspects to them, the sea is wet and mountains are high, and the desert is hot. Different aspects of time also have some characteristics embedded within them. And what's very interesting is that the word for holiday, one of the words for holiday is moed, and moed means a meeting time or a meeting place. The tent of meeting is how the phrase Oel Moed is often used. As the Jews are traveling through the desert, Moshe meets with Hashem at the Oel Moed, which is the tent of meeting, literally. And you can think of, as the earth goes around in the orbit during the year, the earth meets Hashem at certain points of the year, and certain characteristics are more strong during those periods than other periods. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So the 10th of Tishrei, as we all know, is Yom Kippur. So what we say is that it's not Yom Kippur because Moshe came down from the mountain and said that Hashem has forgiven us from the sin of the golden calf, and that since the day he came down was on the 10th of Tishrei, so we're going to celebrate Yom Kippur in commemoration of that day. No, in fact, the way we look at it is that the 10th of Tishrei is a propitious day for atonement. And that's why Moshe came down on that day. And that's why we celebrate Yom Kippur on that day. So similarly, the 15th of Nisan, which is Pesach. So we don't celebrate Pesach on the 15th of Nisan because that date happened to be the date when we came out of Mitzrayim. Rather, the 15th of Nisan is a propitious date for exceeding our limitations, passing over our boundaries, leaving constricting places. It's built into the fabric of time. And so here we have an incident where Lot and his family left Sodom. In a way, like Pesach was in the air. So Lot, whether consciously or not, felt compelled to bake matzahs on that day. So on one hand, on one hand, it was not literally Pesach. On the other hand, what Rashi and the Midrash is telling us is that, but it was on the 15th of Nisan, and Pesach was in the air. And in fact, we learn in Rosh Hashanah, tractate Rosh Hashanah, that Yitzhak's birthday is celebrated on the 15th of Nisan because the angels came, right, on the 15th of Nisan, according to this literal meaning of the Midrash. And they say a year from now you'll have a baby. So the Gemara deduces, therefore, Yitzhak's birthday is 15th of Nisan. Okay, so that's a fairly standard interpretation of Rashi's comment of Pesach Chaya. It was Pesach that day. As we mentioned in a prior shir, the Torah was given to us with little punctuation. It wasn't given to us in Parshas. Really, it was only given to us broken up into different Sfarim, the different books, right? Bereishis, Shemos, etc., and paragraph breaks. And we talked about that. In a prior shir. So what's very interesting, and some of the commentators notice, that all of chapter 18 and chapter 19 is one straight paragraph with no breaks, no paragraph breaks. So what that tells us is that we need to read these two stories together. Again, chapter 18 is the story of the angels visiting Avraham and Sarah, telling them about the birth of Yitzhak, and also the Avraham has the bargaining going on with Hashem about whether Sodom will be destroyed. And chapter 19 is the angels continuing on their visit to Sodom and then the destruction of Sodom. We're supposed to read them together. So one really obvious, it cries out to be, compare and contrast, as they used to say when we used to take a test in literature, right? The exam question was compare and contrast. So to do that with regarding hospitality, how Avraham and Sarah did hospitality, how Lot did hospitality. So right off the bat, and as a tip off, right off the bat, we see some extremely close parallels. So the first pasuk of chapter 18, Avraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent and he sees the three angels. The first verse of chapter 19, Lot is sitting at the game of Sodom and sees two angels, and two of them are the same angels. That invites us to compare and contrast. And we get a first contrast in the very next pasuk. So when Avraham sees the angels, he runs forward to greet them. Lot rises to greet them. So immediately we get the sense that on one hand, Lot does think hospitality is important. On the other hand, he's nowhere near as good at it as Avraham is. Okay, so verse 6 in chapter 18 is really interesting in terms of painting a picture of the hustle and bustle of a very excited household of having guests. That verse says that Avraham hurried and he ran to Sarah and he told Sarah to hurry. The word hurry is used like 3 times in that one pasuk. He told Sarah to hurry, and then he ran to the cattle and he gave it to the youth who hurried to prepare it. You get this whole idea, and the youth here, I mean, obviously Yitzhak wasn't born yet, so other members in his household, his servants and whatnot, everybody's all like really rushing to prepare this sumptuous feast for the angels. The comparison to Lot, it says he baked matzahs, and there's no indication of anybody hurrying anything. And even more telling, I think, is that there is no indication that anybody else in his household cared about it. It says he baked the matzahs. So immediately, like, where's his wife? Where are his daughters? Where's the rest of his household? Like nobody seems to be involved. So we get a sense that, again, Lot has some deep-seated beliefs about the value of hospitality, but he's not so good at it. Even more importantly, of course, as we know the story, is what happens when the townspeople come and start banging on Lot's door, saying, "You have guests in there, give them over to us." So on one hand, Lot is very heroic and wants to stand against these the other townspeople. And as the Midrash tells us, the town of Sodom had actual laws against hospitality. Everybody, they didn't. It was an extremely anti-welfare state, I guess. and even giving tzedakah was you weren't supposed to do. So to invite strangers into your house was against the law in Sodom, and Lot was doing it anyway, and at great personal risk. But in his effort to protect the guests, he offers the crowd. He offers his two daughters to them. Look, I have two young daughters. They've both never known a man. Why don't you take them instead? What a horrible thing. So he's into hospitality, but he's a little bit of a warped and perverted way. And the Torah tells us that Lot sort of he sunk into his state of being gradually. So as you look back in chapter 13, which is last week's Parsha, the Torah describes this step-by-step progression of this downward spiral. So, for example, in chapter 13, we read when he and Avraham split up because they couldn't handle being together. They were encroaching upon each other. I mean, the first thing you think of is like, who can't get along with Avraham? Like, really? So Lot, so Avram says, you know what? Look to the west, look to the east. Take whatever you go your way, and I'll go mine. So Lot, of course, sees a lush field, and he says, I want to go that way. And the Torah points out that the lush fields go all the way up to Sodom. And then the very next pasuk, it says he pitched his tent up to Sodom. So that's interesting because on one hand, it sounds like he's living there. On the other hand, you could say, well, he's living close to there. And you get that impression because in the next chapter, in chapter 14, it says that he dwelt in Sodom. It uses the verb yoshev, which could mean to live in Sodom. It could also mean that he was settled in an emotional level. He was satisfied with being with living in Sodom. As to why Sodom was anti-tzedakah, I have not heard any reasons. It's just a given that happened to be the trait of this group of people, of anti-tzedakah people banded together and said, let's live in our town together. So Lot gets sucked into the ways of Sodom. Not completely, of course. As we pointed out, he was sitting at the gate. He took the strangers in. He risked his household. On the other hand, as you just pointed out, he did not seem to be able to transmit his values to his household. And then, of course, offering his daughters to the raging crowd, which was a pretty heinous act. So I might add here an interesting, mida keneged mida, people getting their just desserts in a way. We when Adam and Chava lose a son because Cain kills Hevel, that Parshas sort of ends. I don't mean Parshas Bereishis, but that section of the Torah ends with them getting a replacement son, so to speak. Now I realize children can't replace each other, but the point is that they end up getting a second son, Seth. Similarly, when Yehuda loses his two sons at the beginning of the incident with Tamar and Yehuda, that chapter begins with him losing two sons, and at the very end of the chapter, through Tamar, he gets twin sons. So it sort of makes up for it in a way. And we sort of see that here. So Lot is willing to give up his two daughters to strangers, and at the end, both of his daughters end up having relations with him. So this poetic justice, I'm not sure how to phrase that, but certainly you can see a symbolic bookends on that sort of thing. All right, we're going to come back to hospitality later. I want to share you this a screen that describes a different aspect of looking at this. So what I'd like to do is call the escape from Sodom Yetzias Sodom, and compare that to Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is what we celebrate at the Seder. Yetzias, of course, means going out. So, Anne, I'm seeing the screen, not you. I presume that you can see it. So we've talked about some of these pasukim here. That Lot was out at the entrance. And the second column is chapter 12 of Shemos of the book of Exodus, talking about us coming out of Egypt, or the beginning of that. And you can see that there's a lot of parallels, not just with the matzah, not just with the entrance to the house. If you go down to the middle here, we see the angels. The angels, when they're talking to Lot, say, we're going to destroy this place, for their cry has grown great before Hashem, and Hashem has sent us to destroy it. And then the townspeople, recall, are struck with a plague, right? They're struck with blindness. So, of course, the plagues are reminiscent of what happens to all of Mitzrayim. The word comes from the word makkah, which means plague or striking, which is makos bakoros, the plague of the first son. We see that word as a very common one. And also the very beginning of when Moshe first gets the call from Hashem and gets his task assigned to him as the Redeemer, Hashem says, for their cry has come to me, which is reminiscent of what the angels are telling when they're explaining to Lot, their cry has come before Hashem. That's why Sodom needs to be destroyed. A very important pasuk here is the phrase, get up and get out of this place, which is exactly what Hashem says, to get up. You're going to have to get up and get out from Mitzrayim. Another, just a linguistic parallel, just very quickly, I won't linger on it, because the word linger, the very first time it appears in the Torah is with the Lot story, that Lot lingered. He was torn. He was torn between, should I believe these guys? All of my wealth is here. It's hard for me to leave, which is why he waited till dawn, and finally the angels just grabbed him. And it's not until chapter 12 over here that is only the second time that this same verb is used, when Hashem tells Bnei Israel that you can't linger in Mitzrayim, you need to come out now. That's exactly what the angels are telling Lot. God rained down upon them fire and brimstone. And that's the same verb that's used when God rained down hail upon Mitzrayim. So the last night before Mitzrayim, each Jewish household in Mitzrayim during the plague of the firstborn, everybody had the first Pesach Seder with matzah, and they were up all night, and then they were packing, and in the morning they left. And it's the same thing with Lot. They have the meal, and then all night they're trying to convince Lot and his household to go. And finally, right before dawn, which is when the Exodus happened, right before dawn, the angels grab Lot and his family. So what are we to make of all this? So what I want to suggest is that Yetzias Sodom is a precursor of sorts to Yetzias Mitzrayim. And one of the central elements, to go back to what we were just talking about, is hospitality, as well as the family-oriented foundation to our lives. Right, the Pesach offering at the times of the Beis Hamikdash was family-centered. It was like the only korban that we didn't do, inside the Beis Hamikdash, that the Kohanim didn't do for us. Rather, the Kohanim shechted it, and then we took it out to the surrounding hills, and we ate the korban Pesach as a family. So this whole, and which carries on to this day. That's why we have the seders of our family, where we tell our children, and it's the only significant, important Jewish holiday event that we specifically have to do with our family. Right, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the important stuff is going on in Shul. or we should, hear a shofar, or we have to do the lulav, or dwell in a sukkah, this and that. But the Seder is something we have to do at home, or we should, if we're able to, do it at home and transmit values to our children. So that makes it unique among all the Jewish holidays. And further, when we get to Halach Ma'anya, this is the bread of our forefathers, or this is the poor man's bread. And when we say all who are hungry come and eat, at our Seder, it has its very source in the very first Pesach of the Torah, which is the Pesach of Lot, whose essence and foundation came from the hospitality of Avraham and Sarah's household. And it was by virtue of this hospitality of Avraham and Sarah that they received the news of Yitzchak, and by virtue of which Lot was saved. So, hospitality and chesed may not be all that we need to bring Mashiach, but I think one of the lessons here is that it surely is a necessary component of that. So now I'm going to tie it all together with one more thing. Speaking of Mashiach, so Lot's two sons are Moab and Ammon. Later on in Sefer Devarim, when Moshe Rabbeinu was giving his last speech to the Jewish people, one of the things he says in chapter 23 is that Bnei Yisrael cannot intermarry with the descendants of Moab and Ammon. And what's the reason he gives? Are they disgusting people? Are they into idol worshiping, avodah zarah? Are they a murderous people? Why can't we marry into those two? We can marry into Egyptian families after a certain number of generations. What's so bad about Moab and Ammon? So what's the reason Moshe gives? He says, because they did not bring you bread and water when you were on the way coming out of Mitzrayim. It's because they couldn't do basic hospitality. So for all time, we cannot marry the descendants of Moab and Ammon. But Ruth was a Moabite. Ruth and Boaz married. So the Talmud learns from that the prohibition against marrying a Moabite for all times applies only to marrying Moabite men. Fine, okay. It turns out that there are a lot of thematic and structural connections between Ruth and Tamar, and the whole incident with Tamar and Yehuda. There's a lot of parallels. We could do a similar thing, side-by-side thing, the parallels between that and the Ruth story and the Tamar and Yehuda story. But what's really interesting about that is Boaz, who Ruth marries, is a descendant of Yehuda and Tamar, which means what? That means that David HaMelech, and therefore the royal line of Israel, and therefore Mashiach, has ancestors both from the illicit relationships, from both significant illicit relationships in the Torah, from Lot and his daughters, and from Tamar and Yehuda. So, with all that, the lessons from that, I think what it tells us, the lessons for the kings is that don't get so haughty, don't get too big for your britches, because look where some of your ancestors come from. The lessons for us who will not and never be kings of Israel, the message to us is one of chizuk, of one of strength. I think it tells us that no matter where we come from, purity of heart and chesed is more important than that. So I think some of the lessons we learn from these two parshas are purity of heart, chesed, and hospitality, and that the little acts we do of being hospitable and acts of chesed can have earth-shattering, positive ramifications that can last thousands of years. That's what Avraham and Sarah and Lot and his daughters and Ruth and Boaz, that's partly what they are telling us with that story. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to hit stop here.